There is an airfield in Antarctica where the runway is not asphalt, not concrete, and not even permanent in the way most people understand an airport. It is compacted snow, 11,000 feet long, built to take heavy aircraft onto the edge of a continent with no cities, no highway network, and almost no margin for error. From there, the nearest major gateway is Christchurch, New Zealand, roughly 2,400 miles away. The South Pole is still about 850 miles farther inland. If weather closes in, the airplane is not simply delayed. An entire scientific supply chain starts to bend. That is what isolation means in aviation. It is not just a scary runway, a short strip, or a dramatic landing video. Isolation is what happens when an airport becomes the only thin line between a place and the outside world. So this is not an official global ranking. There is no single authority that measures every airport on Earth and declares the 5 most isolated. Instead, these are 5 of the world's most isolated airports and airfields, chosen because their isolation can be explained with real geography, climate, logistics, and dependence. Some are surrounded by ocean, some are buried in polar weather, some serve communities with no road to the runway, and one of them does not even take you all the way to the town it exists to serve. The first is Phoenix Airfield near McMurdo Station in Antarctica. Phoenix is not a normal commercial airport. You do not buy a vacation ticket to Phoenix Airfield and step out into a terminal. It is part of the logistics system for the United States Antarctic Program, serving the McMurdo area on Ross Island, where aviation is less about convenience and more about survival, science, and timing. McMurdo is described by the U.S. Antarctic Program as about 2,415 miles south of Christchurch, New Zealand, and about 850 miles north of the South Pole. In normal aviation terms, those are long distances. In Antarctic aviation, they are the beginning of the problem, because between those points there is no conventional network of towns, highways, fuel stops, diversion airports, and rescue infrastructure. There is ice weather, darkness in winter, and a continent that punishes delay. McMurdo has landing strips on the ice shelf and a helicopter pad because different missions require different aircraft. Phoenix and Williams Field support different types of operations, from heavy transport to ski-equipped aircraft. Phoenix Airfield opened in 2017, replacing the role of Pegasus Field for McMurdo operations. Its runway is listed as 11,000 feet or 3,353 meters of compacted snow. That length matters because the aircraft coming here can be large. The point is to move people, fuel, equipment, and supplies into one of the hardest operating environments on the planet. Think of it less like an airport and more like a removable bridge. Every flight is a piece of a larger chain. If the runway surface is not prepared, if visibility collapses, if wind or temperature moves outside the usable window, the bridge narrows. And when that bridge narrows in Antarctica, there is no easy detour. The result is one of the clearest examples of aviation isolation anywhere, a runway whose existence is justified by the fact that there is almost no other practical way to do the job. The second airport is Mataveri International Airport on Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. If Phoenix is isolated by ice, Mataveri is isolated by emptiness. Open a map of the South Pacific and the island looks almost impossible, a small triangle of land surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean. The airport sits near Hangaroa, on a runway so dominant that it nearly cuts across the island's southwestern edge. Rapa Nui is part of Chile, but it is not close to mainland Chile. Mataveri is roughly 2,336 miles northwest of Santiago. That distance alone is enough to make it feel remote. But what makes Mataveri so unusual is not just how far it is from the capital, it is how little exists around it as an aviation alternative. Mataveri is often described as one of the most remote, or even the most remote airports in the world when measured by distance to another airport. That claim depends on the metric being used, so it should be treated carefully. But the underlying reality is real. For long stretches across the Pacific, a pilot does not have the normal comfort of nearby diversion fields. The runway is about 3.3 kilometers long enough for large jets, and historically expanded in connection with NASA's emergency planning for the space shuttle era. That history gives Mataveri a strange contradiction. It is a remote island airport, but it has a runway built to a scale that feels almost oversized for the place around it, and that is the point. In isolated aviation, the runway is not only built for average days, it is built for the worst day you are willing to plan for. On Rapa Nui, distance is the danger. If a flight commits across that ocean, the airport at the end is not just a destination, it is a promise that the chain will hold. Scheduled service has connected the island to Santiago, and Mataveri is a public and military airport. But the geography has not changed. The aircraft may be modern, the runway may be long, and the route may appear routine on a booking website. Underneath it, there is still a brutal fact. Around Rapa Nui, the map is mostly water. The third airport is St. Helena Airport in the South Atlantic. St. Helena is famous for isolation long before aviation enters the story. The island sits more than 1,200 miles from the nearest major continental landmass. For centuries, the ocean defined its relationship with the world. Before the airport, access depended on ships. Historical accounts of the airport project describe the journey from Cape Town as about 5 days by sea, with departures roughly once every 3 weeks. That is not a transport inconvenience. That is an economic condition. Medical travel, tourism, cargo, family visits, business, government, and emergency planning all had to think in ship schedules. So the airport was meant to change the equation. A runway at Prosperous Bay Plain could turn an island measured in days by sea into an island measured in hours by air. It was a classic aviation promise: spend heavily on infrastructure and geography becomes less powerful. But St. Helena proved that isolation does not disappear just because concrete arrives. The airport opened in 2016 with scheduled commercial service beginning in October 2017. Its runway is 1,950 meters long, and the reported cost was about £285.5 million. For a remote island, that was a huge bet. Then came the problem that made the airport internationally famous: wind shear. The island's terrain and weather created difficult conditions for the very flights meant to transform access. The early launch of scheduled service was delayed, and for a time the airport was mocked as a costly mistake. But that simple version misses the real lesson. St. Helena Airport is not just a story about a difficult runway. It is a story about trying to buy connection in a place where the ocean, the cliffs, the wind, and the small size of the market all push back at the same time. The island needed better access. The airport did eventually begin scheduled service, but the process showed that isolation has layers. There is distance, there is weather, there is construction logistics, there is the cost of bringing materials by sea, building a wharf at Rupert's Bay, and moving supplies along a haul road to the airport site. There is also the airline economics of serving a tiny market far from everywhere. A normal airport expands an existing network. St. Helena Airport had to create one where the network barely existed. That is why it belongs on this list. Not because it is abandoned and not because it is simply dangerous, but because its entire history is a fight against geography. The fourth airport is Svalbard Airport Longyear. At first, Svalbard may look less isolated than the others. It has scheduled public flights. It has a recognizable terminal. It connects Longyearbyen with mainland Norway through routes such as Tromsø and Oslo, depending on schedules and season. In a photograph, it can look like a normal airport with snow around it. But look at the latitude. Svalbard Airport sits above 78 degrees north, making it widely described as the northernmost airport in the world with scheduled public flights. It is not just north of the Arctic Circle. It is deep inside the high Arctic. There is no road from mainland Norway to Svalbard. The airport is the public air gate to a community on an archipelago where climate, darkness, sea ice, and permafrost shape daily life. Before permanent aviation infrastructure, parts of the archipelago could be effectively cut off by ship for months. Especially from November to May, the runway is about 2,484 meters long, built on permafrost. That detail sounds technical, but it is central to the story. Permafrost is ground that stays frozen for long periods. Build badly on it, and the runway can move, settle, or suffer frost heaves. In simple terms, the ground itself is part of the engineering problem. So Svalbard's isolation is not the same as Rapa Nui's ocean emptiness or Phoenix's Antarctic barrier. It is institutional isolation. This is a public airport operating at the edge of where regular air service can still look normal. It supports residents, research, tourism, government presence, and connections to other Arctic activity. That is what makes it fascinating. The airport makes the extreme fuel routine. A jet lands, passengers walk into a terminal, bags appear, and the system looks familiar. But outside that system is polar night, a fragile environment, and a settlement depends on aviation to stay connected to the rest of Norway and the world. The fifth airport is Nerlerit Inaat Airport, also known as Constable Point in East Greenland. This may be the most revealing case on the list because the airport does not fully solve the isolation. It only changes the shape of it. Nerlerit Inaat serves Itokorta Ormiet, a community that Visit Greenland describes as the most isolated town in Greenland. But the airport is not in the town. It is about 25 miles away across terrain where there is no simple road connection. After arriving by fixed-wing aircraft, the last stage can require helicopter, boat, or snowmobile depending on season and conditions. That changes how you understand an airport. In most places, landing means arrival. Here, landing may only mean you have reached the next transfer point. The runway is the gateway to the gateway. The airport has a 1,000-meter gravel runway and was originally built in 1985 by Arco for oil exploration in Jameson Land, before being sold to Greenland in 1990. That origin matters. It was not simply born as a convenient passenger airport. It came from resource exploration and a remote landscape, then became part of the access system for one of the most isolated communities in the Arctic. Today, the route structure can involve flights from Iceland to Nerlerit Inaat, followed by the final connection to Itokortormiet. Air Greenland has operated the helicopter link, while Norland Air has been associated with Iceland connections. These services can change over time, so the safest point is not a single timetable. The point is the structure. The airport is separated from the place it serves. That is isolation in its pure logistical form, not just far from a capital city, not just beyond the road network, but dependent on a chain of vehicles, seasons, operators, and weather windows to move a person the final 40 kilometers. And it forces a question most travelers never ask. When does an airport actually connect a community? Is it when the aircraft touches down, or only when people can reliably get from the runway to their homes? These 5 places show why the idea of the world's most isolated airport is difficult to rank. Isolation is not one measurement. Phoenix Airfield is isolated by an entire frozen continent. Mataveri is isolated by the vastness of the Pacific. St. Helena is isolated by ocean, terrain, economics, and wind. Svalbard is isolated by latitude, climate, and permafrost. Nerlerit Inaat is isolated by the final gap between runway and community. None of them is simply a stunt runway. None of them is only about danger. Their importance comes from what they make possible. They turn aircraft into lifelines. They let scientists work in Antarctica. Residents reach medical care. Islands receive tourists and cargo. Arctic communities stay connected, and remote regions maintain a link to the outside world. Modern aviation often makes distance feel small. A line on a booking website can make the planet look connected, but these airports reveal the truth underneath. Connection is not automatic. It has to be built, maintained, funded, cleared of snow, protected from wind, and timed against weather. At the edge of the map, an airport is not just infrastructure. It is a bet that a runway, a few aircraft, and a narrow operating window can hold back the full weight of geography.